Joining me to discuss his 2024 presidential bid is Libertarian presidential candidate Chase Oliver. Mr. Oliver, thank you for being here with me today.
Thank you for taking the time to speak with me. It's always great to speak to folks about the campaign, and thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's immediately dive into your campaign. Many likely remember you from running for Georgia's Senate seat last year. You garnered 81,000 votes. You also competed for Georgia's 5th congressional district election in 2020. So walk me through what inspired you to run for the Oval Office in 2024.
Yeah, well, I've always had a desire for public service and wanted to be a voice for the Libertarian Party and speaking libertarian values and making sure that voters have that alternative. That's why I ran for Congress in 2020 in that special election, because there was no Libertarian candidate. I wanted to make sure there was one on the ballot. In 2022, I was honored to be nominated by my party to represent us in that very vital race that forced the runoff and caused us to have national attention brought to the Libertarian Party and message. And I just felt that, with that momentum I had gained from the 2022 election, I should keep up and keep on this marathon and jump right into the next level, which is 2024 with our presidential race, because there are so many states where ballot access is dependent, and we need to have a bold libertarian voice who's an alternative to the two parties. So I felt like I could be a great messenger, and that I can take that energy and enthusiasm that I got in Georgia and export it to the other 49 states plus DC.
Now let's go into your message. And one of the key focuses of your campaign is immigration reform. Now this comes as the U.S. Citizenship Test is set to get an update. Some worry that alterations such as the addition of a new multiple choice civics section could make the test tougher, while others believe the test is necessary. What's your take on the citizenship test?
I think as long as it is something that, a base level person could pass, I don't think making it more complex or harder is really the path to go on. Really, I think the real problem with our immigration system isn't the citizenship test itself. It is the vast complexity, cost, and time that it takes to come into this country legally under our current system. And we need to really massively simplify that process, because the way it exists now, we have millions of people who sidestep the citizenship test and all the other steps altogether because it's too complex, too costly, too complicated. And so if we can fix that system, it will overall improve the immigration process, because if people aren't even going through the process at all, they're never even getting to the citizenship test portion, and it creates a shadow economy. And so we need to fix the immigration system overall. But as far as a citizenship test, I think it should be one that most people should be able to pass. And I think the one we have now is pretty well done. I don't think there's a need to change it too much, but things will change with time, right? Like you do have to update questions, like we can't be talking about record players and landline telephones anymore on tests. So you do have to update the language from time to time.
And elaborating on that further, what would you do to solve the immigration problems or challenges facing this country?
Yeah, so I would seek to return us to a more of an Ellis Island style immigration, where if people want to come here and work, they just basically have to come right through, declare themselves, they come in, they can work, they can go back. Really, it's kind of an interruption to the free market when we limit the ability of labor and capital to move across borders. And so I would return us back to, again, more of an Ellis Island style immigration, where people can come here and work because the vast majority of immigrants want to do just that. And when we do switch that Ellis Island style immigration, we can actually crack down on the illegal human trafficking and other crimes that happen at the border, because we can focus our law enforcement time and dollars there, as opposed to this broad immigration system that we have now.
Would you support the construction of a wall at the southern border?
I think there's a need sometimes to have fencing, but, spending billions and billions of dollars for a wall that I think ultimately will be ineffective. You build a 20-foot wall, there will be 21-foot ladders, there will be someone to dig underneath it. So I don't really see the need to build these giant walls. And ultimately, if you look at the history, of governments, walls are often used to keep people in and not really to keep people out a lot of the time. And I would avoid that. I want to have a free and open immigration system where people can travel across the border pretty freely and easily. And if we have that Ellis Island system, there's really not going to be the need for the wall, because there won't be as many people seeking to illegally cross the border.
Now, let's transition from immigration to your economic agenda. You say that you will go line by line through the regulatory codes to make it simpler to start a business. How would you go about doing so as commander-in-chief?
Well, you first have to empower Congress to do their job. You can't really do a lot with a tax code without proper legislation. You can only work around the edges as the chief executive. But I would ask that Congress basically simplify the tax code, get rid of all these little regulatory nooks and crannies that had been bought and paid for, mostly by large corporate interests, to make sure that they stay up at the top and they keep competition from growing. I want to simplify that overall. There's our tax code. If you just stack up the size of the tax code, it's like 10 feet tall worth of paper. There's lots of room to simplify. And when we do simplify it, removes the need to have as many people, auditing and doing these other things. And also it makes it easier for businesses and people to file these taxes. I want to simplify that process. And right now we have a tax and regulatory code that just makes it so hard to be a small business that can compete with a medium business, or be a medium business that can compete with the large business. And again, a lot of that is bought and paid for through lobbying. So I would want to simplify our tax code to where we're not having 10 feet worth of paper. Let's get it something smaller that we can actually, identify and use. I just want to point out this last fact. There was a study showing that when people called the IRS helpline with a question about their taxes, 50% of the time they were given different answers to the same question. So not even our IRS professionals understand the tax code because of how complex it is. And we need to reduce the complexity.
Now, are there any specific regulatory requirements that come to your mind that you would seek to get rid of?
Off the top of my head, licensing requirements for a lot of professions, I think, make it harder for people to start the small business. You can even go to the most local level of things like being able to cut hair, braid hair. In Georgia, you have to pay $100 a year to be a fortune teller. I don't know how they regulate that or why the government needs $100 a year from a palm reader, but they do apparently. And so there's just little things like that. That's even at the most local level. But as you get higher up and higher up, you see, business requirements and housing and construction, all kinds of things that make it much more expensive. And there are less expensive options out there that people could access and save money and time.
Now, you've also talked about inflation quite a bit in your platform. You joined some presidential candidates in saying that inflation is a result of government overspending. Why do you believe that to be the cause of inflation, and from what areas or agencies would you seek to reduce spending?
Yeah, so it is not the sole cause of inflation, but it is a major cause, and that is because as we deficit spend every year and add to the national debt, we are printing trillions of dollars out of thin air using the Fed. And when we do that, it actually devalues the dollar. It makes our dollars worth less and less as we print more and more. And so that's affecting people, say, who have savings and other things. And so that is the main driver of inflation, is the fact that we are printing money out of thin air, the devaluing the dollar. Now, the areas we can cut in government, first and foremost, discretionary spending wise, is the Pentagon. The Pentagon is far too large, has a huge bloated budget, and we could cut half of the Pentagon and still be totally military ready to defend ourselves from any kind of invasion, and be still more funded than any other military around the world by a factor. So I think that's the first area in discretionary spending we need to look to cut. But we also have to look to reform and get rid of entitlements over time. Like, that is the largest driver of debt and deficit in our country, are the entitlement programs, which, right now there are people who depend on them. I would not want to take my mother off of her fixed income right now. But over time, younger workers like myself need to remove themselves from the entitlement programs and prepare for a world where those won't exist. Even if we don't get rid of them, they'll go belly up long before we retire.
So it sounds like you would support a phased out end to Social Security, if I'm hearing you correctly.
Absolutely. I support the the Cato plan that it said that current workers can stay in or opt out. But I believe that for people who are currently on the benefits, they need to be allowed to continue getting those benefits, because you can't pull the rug out from underneath elderly folks. That creates a whole new crisis. But yeah, over time, we need to phase the program out so that younger workers can save for retirement in the market, as opposed to using government, which is not really getting them the best return on their investment. So I would support phasing it out and allowing for more private options.
Now, there's also been a lot of talk about the costs of prescription drugs. What's your take on actions by recent administrations to lower those costs?
Yeah, so let's look at the insulin bill that passed. It was one of the things that Senator Warnock championed. He capped the cost of insulin for Medicare patients at $25 at the end user level. That does not make insulin less expensive. It just makes it less expensive at that end user price. The additional cost gets built into everybody paying into Medicare. The real way you lower the cost of insulin is you remove the FDA patent evergreening protections that allow drug companies just to renew their patents over and over again using minor differences. So that way you can have more generic drugs available. I guarantee you, if Mark Cuban could put insulin on his Cost Plus Drugs website, it would be there. So we need to allow for more competition in the marketplace. And we also need to allow for the importation of drugs from outside the country. That would create a market lever to lower the cost here. So there are free market solutions that can lower the cost of drugs that aren't either cost-cutting measures that are going to create shortages or hidden costs that are really getting paid through every taxpayer.
Now, you mentioned Senator Warnock, and you debated him last October. In that debate, you said that the answer to the problem of gun violence is not legislation, but rather a way to address a culture of violence. What do you mean by culture of violence?
So if you look at what has changed in our society and what has led to the rise of mass shootings and things like this, I think a lot of it has to do with the lack of empathy and humanity we put into each other. And I think a big part of that is we've grown up in a social media generation where it's very easy to get behind an avatar, to be dehumanizing other people, to not care about other people, to just see them as blips on a screen. And with that, there's a lack of empathy and humanity. And I think that is not a left or a right problem. I think that is a cultural problem. In addition to that, we're also seeing a lot of these shooters are on prescription, SSRIs and other drugs that we maybe have not studied fully the ramifications of that. We need to look into maybe treating people's mental health care less with drugs and more with talk therapy and other therapies that can be used better than some of these drugs that seem to be a corroborating factor amongst a lot of these shooters. And so those are two areas where I think even more than gun grabbing or unconstitutional red flag laws, we can actually address gun violence in a real way. But part of that is seeing each other as more human. And government can't really solve that problem. That's a problem we have to reach out to together as human beings without necessarily government.
Now, I do want to ask you this. A recent study by the Journal of Trauma and Acute Care Surgery found that mass shooting-related homicides were higher during the years where the federal assault weapons ban was in effect. That ban lasted from 1994 to 2004. What would you say to people, because you're a strong supporter of the Second Amendment, you've said you would repeal any restrictions currently in place. What would you say to people who believe a ban on assault weapons is necessary to reduce the number of firearm deaths in America?
I would point to the fact that there have been times in this country when we haven't had the assault weapons ban, and there's been lower instances of mass shooting. I would also remind people that we're still near historic lows in terms of violent crime and homicides. A lot more people were getting shot per 100,000 in the 1970s before we had assault weapons on the streets, in the ways we do now. So I would just look at historical trends and have to explain to them that it seems like, oh yeah, it seems so simple. We'll just eliminate this kind of gun and all the violence stops. But violence existed in larger numbers before we had assault weapon bans, the numbers that we do. We have more guns in the streets per 100,000 than we do now, but we have a lower crime rate. You have to understand that is not necessarily just related to the number of guns in the streets. The correlation is not there. And so I understand people who feel for gun violence. I've talked to gun violence survivors. I know people who have been victims of violent crime themselves. But at the end of the day, we have to understand you have to have the right to defend yourself. You cannot be left defenseless, particularly in rural areas where, the police might be 20 minutes away and you have seconds to spare if someone is invading your home and trying to harm you or your family. And so we have to be, we have to recognize that those instances exist too. But yeah, I don't know the best way to explain it other than the fact that the math isn't on their side.
Now, I want to go off of that. What would you say to people who say, to that rural person who lives far away from a police station, have a pistol instead of an AK? What would you say to that?
Well, instead of an AR-15, pistols are great for limited use. I mean, they have a limited range of fire. I do believe a rifle for many people is easier to stabilize and use and aim better. So it's just a personal preference as to what firearm you like. I carry a revolver, so I'm kind of old school. I don't like handguns. I have a revolver, which is a little bit more analog. style, I guess, but that's the gun that I'm comfortable with. And so it's really just a matter of, what gun you're most comfortable using. A lot of people who are in the military are already very, very well versed in using rifles. That is the firearm they are most comfortable using. And you also have to remember there are hunting rifles that are not assault weapons that can fire much farther and much more intensity. So the idea that this particular weapon must be outlawed, I just don't see that. I understand people wanting to stop and feel bad about gun violence. I understand wanting to reduce it. I just don't think you do that by banning firearms.
And correct me if I'm reading you incorrectly. It sounds like, the solution is almost focusing more on individuals' health rather than getting rid of or banning weapons altogether from the hands of Americans.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a problem that is just bigger than just the guns, because guns by themselves do not shoot people. It does require human action to do that, and we need to be actually investing in stopping the human actions that cause mass violence as opposed to the tool that it does. Because if you just focus on the tool, you're going to make criminals out of millions of law-abiding Americans.
And the last question I want to ask you on this, there have been over 250 mass shootings in the United States alone this year. Does that number concern you in any way?
Yeah, it does. And it's something that, again, I don't think government is going to be the solution for it. That's a cultural shift that we're going to have to look to. And we need to quit blaming law-abiding gun owners, people who just want to own a gun for protection or for sport or for whatever reason. They are not the cause of these mass shootings. The shooters are, and their ideology is, and their behavior is. And that is what we have to examine, investigate, and cut off at the pass before more mass shootings happen. That's the realistic way to address this. And yes, it does concern me because I have nephews and nieces who are in schools, and I would hate it if somebody came into that school because they knew it was a soft target, that there was nobody there to protect them, or and they were then shot. Like that would horrify me. And so I want to make sure that we're examining the real human element to what mass shootings are.
Now let's transition from gun policy to the death penalty. You have said as president you would relinquish the death penalty. What made you such a strong supporter on that issue?
Namely, the number of wrongful convictions that we see for people who are on death row and the amount of people who have been exonerated, and then also the people who have actually sadly been put to death and exonerated after their death. And I think morally, it's not justifiable if we are putting innocent people to death to use the policy. This is why most of the world has outlawed capital punishment. And it's why many states have outlawed capital punishment, because ultimately it does end up putting innocent people to death at the hands of the state. And we don't have the moral high ground to be able to do that as a government. I believe life in prison is punishment enough for people. And, that's kind of where I stand on it. It's not worth putting guilty people to death if we're also putting innocent people to death.
And in what other ways would you seek to reform the criminal justice system?
I would support ending the doctrine of qualified immunity. And the reason you do that is because you would want people to be able to seek justice in a civil court of law. I would also require that officers hold liability insurance policies. So when they do wrong, it comes out of the insurance policy, not out of the taxpayer's pocket. And also, when you do enough wrongs as an officer, you become uninsurable and you're no longer able to be an officer on the beat. And so it's a free market way to clean up bad cops. I'm opposed to a lot of mandatory minimums because it kind of scares people into taking plea deals a lot of the time and removes judicial discretion. There's a lot of areas from police to courts to prison and on that I think we need to reform the justice system so that it more broadly reflects the need of restitutional justice as opposed to punishing people, which I think is kind of wrong-headed.
Now, various presidents have campaigned on improvements to America's infrastructure. There's been a lot of talk about infrastructure recently. According to the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Report in 2019, the U.S. ranked 13th globally in terms of broad infrastructure quality. Are there any steps you would take to improve America's infrastructure if elected?
Well, currently is the way it exists. Like if I were to be elected president today, like ideally as a libertarian, right, we oppose roads, like we oppose the whole government building infrastructure. We think that can be done through private means. But if I were elected on day one, in the system that we have right now, I would immediately seek to streamline the process to get construction done. So that way we can get boots on the ground, shovels in the dirt, and get any infrastructure that's currently lagging in the pipeline done and funded. I would seek to, not to, and then I would seek to start removing government from a lot of these infrastructure projects. Larry Sharpe, he ran for governor in New York. He had one of my favorite proposals, which is have the Brooklyn Bridge be sponsored. Have a company sponsor the Brooklyn Bridge, put a big sign up that says this bridge is sponsored by whoever, and have them maintain the upkeep for it, because it's instant advertising. Millions and millions of drivers go through it every single day, and it would make its own money back very quickly. I like off the wall ideas like that. Like that's thinking outside the box, and just throwing more and more money at a giant federalized infrastructure that just trickles its way down doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. I think if anything, if infrastructure should be done by the government, it should be done by state and local governments, not necessarily giant federal projects.
So say, let's take that Brooklyn Bridge example. Someone else builds it who's not the government. Would individuals who cross that bridge be paying a toll to that company that built it? Would hopefully the advertising, or the company would hope the advertising brings business? What would sort of be your look for how that?
Yeah, I actually think if we're going to be funding infrastructure, toll is not a bad way to do it, as opposed to just taking out of the taxpayer's pocket, because that's a user fee. Someone is using that product, and so they are then paying for that product. I think that's a much better way than just taking lump sums out of people's pockets via taxation and income tax, and then being like, well, we need to use this for this and that for that. If there's a need for more roads in an area, you're going to see tolls getting collected and the ability to build extra lanes, because there will be the profit motive to do that. And even with like things like rail, there's a light rail system right now in Florida that's completely privately funded that goes from Orlando to Miami. It's about to come online. And that was done all without the government funding and the increased regulation that comes with government funding. When government's dollars get involved, there's a lot of added costs that come with it. And so they actually found that building this rail program in Florida without so much government help and government subsidy was the way to go. And I think there's promise there.
Let's transition to foreign policy. You want to focus America's foreign policy towards peace. Why do you believe that to be the answer to America's role abroad?
Well, I think because we need to change our mindset that we've had since 9/11 of this war on terror mindset. When we've done that, we have created a military footprint all over the world. We have been drone bombing all over the world, and that has created ill will for our government and for our people. And the best way that we can create goodwill is to remove that military footprint, to start actually talking more about trade as opposed to warfare, and really seek to have a more peace-centered foreign policy that is focused on diplomacy as opposed to getting our way at the barrel of a gun or with the drone bomb of our choice. So that is, I'm somebody who really opposes the initiation of force. And so if I were president, I would seek to scale back our military adventurism around the world and really focus more on creating market relationships with nations so that we can have as much trade as possible. Because when people are trading with one another, they're not shooting at one another. The
war in Ukraine has passed its 500th day. Do you agree with the sentiment that the war is a fight for democracy? That's what some U.S. leaders, including President Biden, have used as means to supply arms to the country. Do you agree with that sentiment? And more broadly, do you think America has a role in championing democracy abroad?
I think it's a little bit hyperbolic to say like this is the quintessential struggle for democracy. It's the struggle for democracy in Ukraine. And I think that's worth noting is that, Ukraine was invaded by a foreign power, and we need to be able to call that out. That doesn't mean that we have to then invest ourselves militarily into the conflict. In fact, when we do that, it makes it harder for us to diplomatically find a solution. I am all for, I think if we need to be doing anything in Ukraine and Russia, we need to be allowing dissidents and refugees to be able to get out of the zone and come to the United States. That's the best thing that we can do, is to get people who are innocent out of the war zone for the time being. And, America's role in defending democracy is to live by example. We call ourselves the land of the free, but getting back to criminal justice a bit, we are the most incarcerated country on earth. And so we have to live by our values and our example. So if the best way we can export democracy abroad is to be a free and open and classically, what I would say a classically liberal democracy here in the United States, and allow others to see the success of that and then export those values around the world, maybe not necessarily with a war. But yeah. And last thing I want to say on Ukraine is while I don't think our military should be investing over there, we should be selling weapons. I think privately, if people want to sell arms to Ukraine, or privately, if you want to go and fight in that war, I'm not going to stop you. And I don't think anybody should stop them, but I don't think our government should be involving itself there.
Are there scenarios in which you would support putting American troops abroad? Is that something that in a certain case you would be okay with?
It would have to really, you'd have to show that there is a direct, and when I say direct, I don't mean tangentially like Iraq or even Afghanistan. You'd have to show me a direct threat to the national security of the United States for me to put troops abroad. In fact, even look at World War II. We did not directly get involved in the war until our sovereignty was attacked by Japan. We were providing Lend-Lease programs and doing other things for our allies. But we didn't put boots on the ground until we were attacked. And that needs to be the threshold of when we go to war, is if we are attacked or there is like an imminent attack that is about to happen. But that doesn't excuse a lot of the military adventurism we've had, certainly in my adult lifetime.
Now, one foreign policy event that's been in the news is NATO. Sweden is set to join NATO as its 32nd member. One of your opponents in the Libertarian primary, Mike Termott, has called for an end to U.S. membership in the alliance. What's your take on NATO?
I think overall, over time, we do need to separate ourselves from that alliance. It's an entangled alliance. And over time, I do think that we need to be removing ourselves from that and allow Europe to kind of take the lead there if they want to. It's their continent. Like if they want to run NATO, let them run NATO. But right now, the United States has been overwhelmingly the largest funder of NATO, the largest provider to NATO. And so I think it's about time that the NATO alliance in Europe actually starts kind of taking the lead there, and we can start removing ourselves from that. But that being said, if Vladimir Putin's insistence was like not having NATO on his border and that was his excuse to go into war with Ukraine, he's absolutely failed with Sweden joining NATO, because now there is a NATO nation right on his border. And the resolve from NATO is actually stronger. And so if that was the goal of Russia by invading Ukraine, was to weaken NATO, it was a major mistake. And I don't think you're going to see that breakup of NATO happening until Russia pulls itself back. And so that's just the reality of the thing, of the conditions on the ground. I also think Ukraine should not be allowed to join NATO, because it's in the charter that as long as there's a conflict or a border dispute, they shouldn't be allowed to join. And since Crimea was occupied, that's been the case. So that's kind of how I feel about the alliance right now and where it should be heading.
What, in your opinion, is the biggest foreign policy threat to the United States?
Our biggest foreign policy threat is, really underestimating the ability of our international competitors to be investing in markets around the world. When we reduce our ability to trade, that weakens us in terms of national security. Because again, when we are trading with people, they're not shooting at us. And so what you're seeing is other powers creating massive investments, particularly in Africa and Latin America, or particularly in Africa right now, where we should be really taking the lead and we should be trying to be market partners. That's the biggest threat. I don't think there's really a military power that really threatens us right now, because of how massive our military is, and just we're so much more well-funded in terms of the military than anyone else. So foreign policy-wise, I think it's our loss of market share around the world is really the biggest threat to us foreign policy-wise.
And going off of that, what do you think is the biggest challenge facing America today?
The biggest challenge facing America is that we have continued to polarize each other and other each other and refuse to listen and have empathy for other people. Part of the reason why I'm running is to be a voice for those who feel like the two-party system has left them behind or has continued to ostracize them, and that there's not a place for them. The breakdown in just civil discourse in this country, I think, is a real harm that we're seeing, and it's not getting any better with the duopoly. And we really need to break down the two-party system in order to really start healing the wounds that are dividing this country all along really every political line. But this is mostly due to extreme hyperpartisanship. And I think that is a major, major threat to this country, to our peace, and to our sovereignty.
Now, last year, you did not ultimately win Georgia's Senate election. You're now campaigning to convince millions of Americans to put you in the Oval Office. What will you do differently this time around to convince citizens to put you in public office?
Well, I can only say that I'm going to work that much harder at getting out and reaching out to people one-on-one. I felt that was the most successful part of my Senate campaign. And, the limitations that I had there was, some fundraising limitations, the ability to get out and get all over the state. I have not had nearly the same kind of problems since running for president. There's been a lot more enthusiasm, and I've been getting a lot more support all across the country. So I'm going to keep doing what I was doing in the Senate race, but turn it up and really get out and try to reach out to new audiences. I love being the libertarian in the room, walking into a room full of people who aren't libertarian yet, and then we walk out with more than me just being the only libertarian there. That's what I seek to do all over the country, and I'm going to keep working very hard at it. And I hope folks can get out. And if you see me traveling, say hello, shake my hand. I'd love to hear from you, and I'd love your support.
And as president, how would you go about cooperating with members of different parties?
Yeah, sometimes you have to be the adult in the room, and you have to be able to bring people together. Nothing is going to be perfect in the world of politics. And if I were elected president, I would have to understand that I'd probably be dealing with a lot of Democrats and Republicans in Congress. And part of the job of being president is being the one in the room who can get the agreement done. You cannot let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I will always have my eye on the libertarian ideal, but I will never, ever let that perfect ideal be the enemy of getting progress done and getting us to where we have a reduced state. So, I look forward to working with the Republicans and Democrats. I do it on single issues all the time. So let's get me elected, and we'll see how well it goes.
And before we end off, what would you like to say to voters ahead of the primary?
Well, I would tell voters, I wish you would check out my website, votechaseoliver.com. Again, if you see me out traveling, say hello to me. Let's talk. Let's have a conversation. I'd love to hear your feedback. The biggest thing that I can say to voters out there is that I'm going to be an honest voice, and a voice who is not looking to the old parties and the old solutions that have kept us stagnant for so long. It's time that we move forward in the 21st century. And that's what I'm seeking to do as our nominee for president. And hopefully, if I get elected, I can make that change in Washington, D.C.
Libertarian candidate for President of the United States, Chase Oliver. Mr. Oliver, thank you so very much for being here with me today.
Thank you.